Welcome to Behind the Doc Lens. I'm your host, Olga Medvedev-Young. Our guest today is Susan Gray, an award-winning producer, director, and writer for Northern Light Productions in Boston. She has worked on projects all over the world, and her work has been aired on PBS, National Geographic, and the Discovery Channel, to name a few. She's here today to share insight on her powerful documentary, Killer Poet: The Double Life of Norman Porter. The film features the infamous story of an escaped convict who was on the run for 20 years. This is Behind the Doc Lens.
The evil that men do live on forever. The good is oft interred with their bones.
This is my Uncle Dave. He was shot in the head and murdered.
Norman Porter had a sawed-off shotgun and a pistol in his belt. Jackie turned around, and when he did, Porter just raised the gun and shot him in the back.
If I knew he'd murdered people and not finished his sentence, that would have been a big problem for me.
I could not ignore the fact that this killer and thief was out there every day breaking the law.
He took up the study of poetry and grew to love it and became a poet.
It wasn't just simply JJ up on stage reading his poetry. It was JJ. It was JJ.
Kids loved him. Whenever he'd appear, they'd run out of the classroom and hug his legs and go, JJ, JJ.
So I am here with Susan Gray. Susan, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
So tell us, Norman Porter, what is his story?
Norman Porter was from this area. He grew up in Woburn, and he was accused of killing a store clerk. He robbed a clothing store, Robert Hall's on Route 1, and he had an accomplice, and a clerk was killed during the holdup. And he was given a life sentence. And then he broke out of prison, again with another accomplice, and the accomplice shot the head of the prison. So he was given a second life sentence. So he had 2 life sentences, and he was a young guy. He was like 19, 20 when all this happened. And he served 25 years, became the model prisoner. It was sort of in the 70s, and a period where we really believed that we could rehabilitate people, educate them, and Norman was the best example of that. He became a poet, and he started training and teaching the other prisoners. And he was supposed to be given parole, but he wasn't given parole for political reasons, and so he escaped, and he went to Chicago. And he lived under an alias in Chicago for 20 years, and was actually Poet of the Month in Chicago when they found him 20 years later.
So what inspired you to tell his story?
2 things. There was a series of articles in the New York Times that came out and talked about prisoners who had gotten life sentences in this country. The feeling was that young men are violent. There's a lot of testosterone floating around, and until they're like 40 or 50, they can be very dangerous. So when a life sentence was given out, it was meant to keep them in prison long enough so they weren't dangerous to society, with a hope that they'd be rehabilitated. But our system has changed, and it's become more politicized, and you can't be soft on crime. So he was never paroled. So whereas the thinking was he won't be in there for the rest of his life, he'll be able to be released and contribute to society, he was never allowed to be released. And what this article is saying is that prisoners are going in at 19 and they're coming out in coffins at 82, and we're warehousing these people, and that was not what the system was meant to do. So that happened at the same time that I was making a documentary film about Vietnam, with the attorney of Norman Porter. And while we were making the film, Norman Porter was found 20 years later. And he kept saying, he's going to die in prison. I know he's going to die in prison. You know, and here he had lived in Chicago a very peaceful life and helped a lot of people and was a poet. So he was really worked up and upset by it. I thought, well, this is interesting enough to make a film about it. But then when you start making a film, I work really through emotions, and I start trying to figure out what to me is interesting about the story.
He got out and he made a lot of friends, and he was kind of a good contribution to society.
Right, as much as he was capable of being, I think. And I think, as he says in the film, he did that in prison too. He didn't just, you know, try and help people when he got out. He was trying to help people while he was in prison. And that's why he had a lot of supporters trying to get him out.
So perhaps he deserved a second chance?
So perhaps he deserved a second chance. I found it interesting that here was the same person. I think by the time we were making the film, the crime had happened 50 years ago. So people couldn't even remember the crime anymore. And there were two different Norman Porters. There was the Norman Porter that people knew in Massachusetts as the killer, and there was the Norman Porter that people knew in Chicago as the poet. And they didn't know that he was the same person. And so that's why we named the film Killer Poet. When we started this film, we couldn't film Norman. We weren't allowed to film in maximum security prison, so our viewers would never know what Norman Porter was like. So we spent time in Massachusetts learning about this horrible guy, the killer, and we spent time in Chicago learning about this wonderful guy, the poet.
Yeah.
And then in the trial, when he's captured, the two characters come together. But every film is different. This was a very weird one. I'd say we were at rough cut stage. The film was all edited together, and Deval Patrick was voted in as governor of the state, and suddenly the rules changed, and we were allowed to film Norman in maximum security prison, and we were given 1 hour to do the interview, and we had a film already made. So we went and we did, I knew what I needed, and we went and did it, and we got what we needed. It was really, really stressful. I mean, we're filming in the prison, and we came back and we edited him in. So the structure of not knowing he's the same guy, you know now, because he's telling the story about his life in Massachusetts, and he's telling a story about his life in Chicago. But what happened now was that you could look at Norman and decide for yourself if you believed him or you didn't believe him. And it just made it so much more interesting.
Well, as a viewer, I felt conflicted. Was that your intention, for the viewers to kind of be not sure?
What I sort of wanted was this feeling of going back and forth through the whole film, through everybody's eyes. Do I like him? Do I not like him? Do I trust him? Do I not trust him? And you get caught up in this game that everybody's playing. And in the very end, you say, okay, I might like him, I might not like him, but does the guy deserve to spend the rest of his life in maximum security prison? And I think you should have a moment of sadness, even for your own reaction throughout the film. It's like, God, I was so busy worrying whether I liked him or not, and it's like, no, he should not be dying in prison. He committed the crime when he was 19. He spent his life doing good things for people. We spend I mean, we didn't bring this in, but if you talk about how much money we spend every year on keeping Norman Porter in prison, it's a huge amount of money. And if you think about the people who we should be getting in prison, who escape from prison, go out and start killing people all over again because they really are bad people, those are the people who should be behind bars, not somebody who, because what do we have with Norman? We have an example of a man who we didn't want to test out on the street. He tested himself out on the street. So we have a test. We have a 20-year test. Did he kill anybody? He didn't. As far as we know, he only helped people. You know, I don't think any of us have spent a day in maximum security prison, but talking to Norman, it's just a total nightmare. And that's what this man lives every day of his life.
I want to talk a little bit about the filmmaking process.
Okay, fun.
So what was the very first step you took? You found out through your lawyer about Norman Porter. What did you do? You pick up your camera and you go shooting, or what happened?
So I had the really good fortune of working at a production company, and I had never had that luxury before. I'd always been a filmmaker who had to go find money to pay a cameraman to go out and shoot. So at the production company, there were lots of cameramen and lots of cameras. So the first thing I did was the trial was happening. So I convinced the head of the company, Bester Cram, to let us go and film it. So we grabbed all the cameramen in the office and all the sound people and all the gear, and we got permission to go film in the court. So the very last scene that you see in the film, the court scene, that was the first thing that we ever filmed.
Awesome.
And then we picked up the characters, so we knew who was who from the testimony, and then we started spending time with each of the characters and sort of worked backwards on the story.
In other words, you met the characters at the trial, and that's how you got to locate them.
Right, so we met the people from Chicago who had flown to Massachusetts for the trial, and then we went back to Chicago and spent time with them.
So the trial really kind of launched this documentary in a way.
Exactly.
What about the distribution process? So you have this film, you edited it. How do you put it out there?
Well, so we made a really big mistake, which all filmmakers are told never to make, and we made it. And that is that we used really famous musicians. So we used our favorite music in the rough cut. So we edited Tom Waits and Lou Reed, and the rights to that music is exorbitant. You can't ever afford it. But we had the good luck and the bad luck of we made a rough cut and we sent it off to Hot Docs, which is this huge film festival, the largest in North America. It's in Toronto. And we were accepted in competition. So now we had a choice. Either we online the film and go to Hot Docs, or we say no thank you and we finish and we go out and have the music composed. So we said, okay, we're gonna go. We online the film and we had this music. So, went around to all the film festivals. It did very well. It was picked up by some broadcasters in Europe, but what they were paying in licensing fees to show the film wasn't enough to cover the music. And we didn't have a budget to cut new music, and we didn't have time, and we sort of moved on. And even though it was seen in a lot of film festivals, and it was great because both sides would come, so you'd have the pro-Norman and the anti-Norman factions together arguing on stage at every film festival. It never was really seen that much. And so I went to some friends up on the North Shore to have them compose some music for the film. A guy named Jason Roberts, he worked crazily for 2 years, and now it has all this beautiful music on it, and now we can get it out there, but it's an old film now.
Yeah.
So I think we're looking into internet distribution and just having it someplace where people can see it.
So I want to talk about the other side of Norman Porter, the poetic side. So we actually have a clip. So let's jump to that clip and have our audience take a look.
Walking across the rose grave in winter, feeling the cold of 2 years at Walden Pond, I recount the $28.12 in my pocket, deep in my pocket. My arms feel like they belong to my ancestors. Pure white snow falls like albino tea leaves, grown from clouds sprung from Henry's eyelids. And his grave is outside a walled prison. His grave, wrapped around the prison. A quiet desperation he would not have understood. Dziękuję.
So that was a clip of one of his poems and that beautiful pan over the cemetery. Talk about that particular poem.
Norman was a really good poet, and he was quite an intellectual. He read a lot of books, he studied a lot of poetry, knew the poets that he was talking about in that poem, and that particular scene was a complete coincidence. We had no idea that the victim, one of the victims, the jailer, was buried in the same cemetery as all these poets that had inspired him, and that he had written actually a poem about one of the grave sites there. So the fact that there was an overlap was just really beautiful. And the thing about the film was we were discovering Norman's poems as we went. And there was one other example where a lot of his poems were hard to find because, he's writing from prison, and it's not like he was being published in books. Where do you get Norman's poems? Yeah. And so we went to interview a man who had taught him in prison, and he had a book of prisoners' poems, and there was one by Norman Porter. And it was about his first victim. And so here is this man just reading this poem that's so heartfelt. Norman is just showing all of the pain, and I found out later it took him years and years of therapy to be able to write that poem. He's showing all the emotions and regret of how that one moment in time has changed his life forever. And it's interesting because he called the poem "The Man I Killed," and Norman always says, it doesn't really matter whether I pulled the trigger or not. I was there on that day, and because he says he did not pull the trigger, it was his accomplice, and he said, had I not been there on that day, that man would be alive. So whether I pulled the trigger or not, I killed that man, and he takes full responsibility. And the victims' families see that as a I got you moment, because he says it's the man I killed. So for them, it's proof that he actually pulled the trigger, and I don't see it that way.
Do you think Norman would have ever become the poet that he is today hadn't he killed a man?
I think he was a juvenile delinquent. I think he was a kid who was probably overly exuberant. That's the term they put on these really bright children now. And I think he had a lot of intellectual curiosity. Had he grown up in a different world where he had been recognized for his intelligence and his brilliance and his capabilities, yeah, I think he would have. I think the fact that he got into prison in an environment that encouraged him to write poetry was the reason that it happened in real life.
What was the initial kind of objective for it?
I think I wanted to, in a way, as a filmmaker, you set challenges for yourself. I wanted to take the message that was in the New York Times article about life in prison. Should we really be, if you commit a crime at 19, should we be taking you out in a coffin at age 85? Is that how we want to treat people who make horrible mistakes when they're young? And tell it through a person. And when I was trying to get funding for the film, people would say to me, well, why don't you pick a really obvious character? I mean, why don't you pick somebody who didn't really commit the crime and is being warehoused anyway and shouldn't be in prison in the first place? They're much more sympathetic than this guy. And I think those cases are the easy cases. Those are easy. You're like, oh my God, this is justice gone wrong. This person shouldn't be in here. In Norman's case, he was, I mean, you saw him yourself. Yeah. He's a confusing person. Do I like him? Do I not like him? Do I trust him? Do I not trust him? And I think that's what the majority of prisoners are. They're not the best citizens in the world. They're people who have gone to the wrong side and are trying to find their way back. So I thought Norman was through his story, I thought you learned a lot of lessons.
Did you have a hard time getting a hold of all the archives with the police department?
We got such crazy luck on this film. Sometimes films are just meant to be made, and this was one of them. So we went and interviewed this person in Chicago who told a story about a poetry reading where Norman was drunk, and how that had upset everybody so much because Norman had been sitting around. They took forever to get to the poetry reading. He started drinking, and he shows up drunk. And out of the blue, we find a guy who had filmed it. And I think he wrote us and said, I've got this footage. And so we have the footage that goes with the story. And it's a great moment in the film because he did have a drinking problem. And he was, do you remember that? He's hysterical.
Yes,
he's really funny.
Yeah, no, that clip definitely made him a little bit more likable.
And everybody's rolling their eyes around him going, oh God, Norman, you're drunk, Yeah. No, we had really good luck on the archive.
Well, it's quite the story, and I'm so glad that you came out here to share it with us and to share
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad you watched. It makes me happy every time somebody sits through that film and has an emotional reaction at the end. I loved it.
Susan, thank you so much for sharing Norman's story with us. We wish you all the best. And thank you for joining us on Behind the Doc Lens. Till next time, I'm your host, Olga Medvedev-Young.